Good evening, everybody. Welcome and thank you very much to our alumni, staff, donors, friends and supporters for joining us today for this session, particularly for joining us on such a sunny evening. It's really appreciated. Today's digital showcase will be recorded and you'll be sent the link afterwards if you want to see it again, or if you'd like to share it with anybody, that's absolutely fine. My name's Professor Jeremy Hall. I'm director of our Neuroscience and Mental Health Research Institute here in Cardiff University. And I'm joined this evening by my friend and colleague, Professor Paul Morgan. And together we direct our Hodge Centre in Neuropsychiatric Immunology. And we're very pleased to welcome our community of Cardiff graduates, friends and supporters to hear about our work in this area, which is bringing together two fields that are very strong in Cardiff, in neuroscience and in immunology, to this fascinating new frontier of how the immune system operates in the brain and affects risks for a range of disorders, from depression and Alzheimer's disease to schizophrenia. There will be a chance for question and answers at the end, and if you have questions, please use the Q&A function and we'll pick those up as best we can at the end. Some questions have actually been already sent in, so we'll be answering some of those as well. So thanks for your enthusiasm. I'm now going to hand over to Paul, who'll tell you a little bit about the importance of this area in Cardiff's activities, and then we'll hear from our speakers tonight. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me just get my slides up. Right, I hope you can all see the slides. I can, so I guess you can too. So as Jeremy said, I'm Paul Morgan, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to introduce this important topic to all of you. So my role is just quickly to give an introduction about the immune system and why it's important in particularly diseases of the brain, but also in the health of the brain. I just want to define a few things to begin with so that we don't have confusion, that we are all talking about the same things. When I talk about immunity, I'm talking about the ability of an organism to resist an infection or a toxin, a huge component of how we defend ourselves, exactly how the vaccines are going to protect us against COVID and so on. This is a very broad brush thing, which is defense against threats, really. Inflammation, even though I talk about them almost as if they were one and the same thing, is just a part of immunity. It's a physiological response that is part of the way that we resist infection, to destroy bacteria, to clear debris and bad things in the body, to take out the garbage, as I often refer to it. It's accompanied by all the things you know when you've got an inflamed joint or an inflamed finger or whatever. The area gets red, swollen, hot and painful, the cardinal signs of inflammation. A reaction to injury and infection, but something which has a huge propensity to go wrong, to be overactivated and then to cause disease. And that's obviously the case because Time put it on their front cover. This is Time magazine from a few years ago. The secret killer, inflammation, and its role in a very large group of diseases affecting organs as diverse as the heart, the kidney, and the brain. And the brain is what we are focusing on here, and inflammation in the brain is an important part of a variety of diseases, and I'll briefly describe those in just a moment, and even led to colleagues of ours in Cambridge writing books on the inflammation in the brain, the inflamed brain, how the brain inflammation can contribute to diseases we used to think of as purely psychiatric, if you like, depression, schizophrenia, and things like this. So let's look at these diseases that are linked to neuroinflammation. First of all, those we've known were inflammatory for a very long time, like multiple sclerosis and a related disease called neuromyelitis optica, where inflammation is the key driving factor. Take away inflammation and you have a very marked effect on the process of the disease. Then we have a group of dementias. We used to think of dementias like Alzheimer's disease as being degenerative diseases, where what's happening is basically the brain is slowly decaying and you therefore can't do much about it. We now know that's not the case at all, and all of these so-called degenerative diseases have a large component of inflammation in them, at least in the early stages of the disease, and that gives us a target for therapies. Brain injury and brain traumas are heavily driven by inflammation. If one has a stroke, an area of the brain gets killed by the ischemic episode, but then the injury is much worsened by the fact that inflammation occurs all around that area to damage or to traumatize more of the brain. So if we can stop the inflammation, we can reduce the injury. And much the same with trauma. Direct injury is followed by inflammation, which makes the actual downstream injury even worse. And then perhaps the biggest surprise for us was the roles in the neuropsychiatric disorders like depression and schizophrenia. And we'll hear more about that as we go through the talks today. My own interest is in Alzheimer's disease, and we know now that Alzheimer's disease, this disease which causes the brain to decay and to shrink, as shown in these pictures here, is, at least in its early stages, highly inflammatory. We know that things that cause inflammation, like head injury, like chronic infections, even poor oral hygiene, can drive systemic inflammation, body inflammation, which leads to a more accelerated course of dementia. And we know that in some studies, at least, the anti-inflammatory drugs, if given for a very long time, for years and years, can slow or reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And when we look at the Alzheimer's disease brain using clever imaging techniques like this PET scan here, we see huge amounts of inflammation in the brain, all this yellows and reds compared to the healthy control brain here. So we're very interested in how inflammation and immunity contribute to these very diverse brain diseases. And out of that has come the collaboration, which Jeremy's already mentioned, between immunology and neurosciences. It's happened in Cardiff, I think, very easily because of the highly collaborative environment that we have here and that has been developed over the last decades, the 3 decades I've been here, certainly. And bringing together people who think maybe differently, but with the same broad aims to generate something different. So out of that came the Hodge Center for Neuropsychiatric Immunology, which we were very grateful to obtain major funding from the Hodge Foundation for in 2016. And that's done fantastic things for us in terms of studentships, fellowships, and other supports, and has really crossed the divide between neurosciences and immunology by generating these joint projects. And more recently, the Dementia Research Institute, a very large funding from the MRC and the dementia charities to 6 centres across the UK. Cardiff has one of those, and one of our major themes in the Cardiff Centre is neuroinflammation. So it's now become a major research focus for us in Cardiff. So today we're going to hear from 2 people who've been involved in neuroimmunology, neuroinflammation research in Cardiff. At the sort of opposite ends of the career path, if you like. We first have Laura Westacott, an early career researcher and non-clinical fellow. And then we will go to Neil Harrison, a clinical professor in neuroimaging and a relatively recent recruit to Cardiff, who's really, again, bringing the clinical immunology ties, the clinical inflammation ties into the imaging expertise we have in Kubrick in Cardiff. So Laura, if you're ready, please take control. I'll stop sharing now and leave you to pick up.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. I'll just start my video. Paul, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Did I not stop sharing? I thought I had.
Okay. Okay, I'll just share my screen. Sorry, 1 second, just being a bit slow. Okay, brilliant. So hopefully you can now see the PowerPoint. So thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. So I'm Dr. Laura Westacott, and today I'm going to be telling you about my work on the immune system and its role in brain development and psychiatric disorders. So just to tell you a bit about myself, so I'm Welsh. I grew up in the nearby town of Cowbridge before coming to Cardiff University to study psychology at undergraduate level. After this, I completed my PhD in neuroscience and immunology. And after my PhD, I had an excellent opportunity funded by the Waterloo Foundation. I received an early career research fellowship, and this was subsequently followed by funding from the Hodge Center. And these opportunities really allowed me to develop my research portfolio to a point where I've recently been successful in obtaining my first funding as an independent researcher from the Medical Research Council. And I'll be telling you about my plans for this later. So my interest in the immune system first arose during my psychology degree. I was intrigued by the interaction between stress and disease and how the immune system may mediate this. I was fascinated by research showing that short-term psychological stresses, such as public speaking, can temporarily boost facets of the immune system, whereas longer-term chronic stresses can inhibit it with consequences for disease. I was also captivated by a lesser-known aspect of the immune system known as the behavioural immune system. This is a set of psychological mechanisms that help us detect cues of pathogens in people and in our environment. This is something we've all become acutely aware of over the last year in the midst of a global pandemic, and for many, now hearing someone cough triggers deep paranoia. The behavioural immune system is closely linked with emotions such as anxiety and disgust, and these emotions motivate us to reduce our exposure to pathogens, and this allows us to engage in behaviours such as hand washing and behaviours that reduce our risk of exposure to pathogens. And a recent study found that greater pathogen avoidance is linked to greater adherence to social distancing measures, greater perceived threat of vulnerability to COVID-19, and also greater anxiety. So we know that activation of the immune system associated with fighting infections and inflammation can influence our mood and emotional well-being. This is part of an inflammation-induced behavioural adaptation known as sickness behaviours. And these are characterised by generally reduced activity, low mood, social withdrawal, and increased anxiety. And these are just temporary effects of inflammation on mood. But what if the immune system had longer lasting impacts on our mental well-being and could even contribute to psychiatric disorders? So there is now evidence for altered levels of immune proteins in many psychiatric disorders. And it's important to note that these alterations are seen at baseline and are not just associated with responses to infectious illnesses. These disorders include depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and bipolar disorder. However, in these studies, we're not able to disentangle whether the changes in the immune system are secondary to the psychiatric diagnosis or vice versa. So a big advance in our understanding of the relationship between the immune system and psychiatric disorders came in 2017 when an important genetic study was published. So in the study, the researchers sequenced the genomes of large groups of individuals with schizophrenia, and they compared areas of variation within their DNA to those of healthy controls. And what they found was that the area most significantly associated with risk for having schizophrenia was an area of the genome known to play a key role in immunity, and in particular the complement system. And you can see this variant here. So what is the complement system? It's a multifunctional system. It's our first line of defense against pathogens in the immune response. It works in a cascade-like fashion through over 30 proteins and receptors, and its main functions are to identify and destroy pathogens and also to control inflammation and also adaptive immune responses such as the antibody response. So my research has investigated the effects of one of the main pathways in the complement system. So C3 is the central protein. It gets broken down into a byproduct called C3A, which then binds to a C3A receptor. And I've looked at the impact of this pathway on emotional behaviours using a test called the elevated plus maze, which you can see here. So this is a test classically used in rodents for anxiety, and it tests their natural behavioural responses to novel open spaces. And this induces mild anxiety in rodents due to their innate fear of bright exposed places where they would be vulnerable to predators if they were in the wild. And as you can see, this apparatus has two open arms and two closed arms. And we put the rodent on the maze and we measure the amount of time the animal spends in the different zones of the maze. And as you can see in this heat map, where we have the closed arms horizontally and the open arms vertically, what we tend to see in normal mice is they will explore all regions of the maze, but they do prefer staying in the closed arms, and that's because some level of anxiety is adaptive. However, when we did this test in mice in which we had switched off either complement C3 or the C3A receptor, we found that the C3A receptor, the mice lacking the C3A receptor showed exaggerated anxiety behaviours. So as you can see, they spend very little time on the open arms. So this showed us that the C3A receptor had fundamental impacts on anxiety behaviour. So how might the C3 receptor influence anxiety in this manner? We know that aside from the classical immune roles I discussed, complement is also important for shaping the developing brain. So we know that complement proteins control the division of stem cells in the developing brain, and these cells give rise to neurons and other important cell types. When those neurons are born, complement is important for guiding the immature neurons to the correct locations within the neuronal architecture. And finally, we now know that complement is important for the correct wiring of the brain through a process known as synaptic pruning. So synapses are the gaps between neurons through which messages are passed from neuron to neuron, and thus synapses are vital for communication. So one possibility is that the links between the C3 receptor and anxiety that I've seen may be due to the way in which synapses are formed and shaped in brain regions that are important in emotion. So how does synaptic pruning occur? So we know that during infancy, when the brain forms, there are many more synapses than are actually needed. And the density of these synaptic connections between neurons increases over childhood, but then the density begins to sharply drop off around 4 years of age. And this reflects the process of synaptic pruning. So the process of synaptic pruning, it means that the excess synapses are removed and only the necessary connections remain, and that allows the neuronal communications to become more efficient and for those neuronal networks to mature. However, as you can see in this graph, where the blue and purple areas represent more mature brain regions, the most rapid time of brain maturation is actually during teenage years. And the process of brain maturation is not fully complete until at least the early 20s. So as for the actual mechanisms of synaptic pruning, we now think that immune cells known as microglia, which can be thought of as a type of Pac-Man cell in the brain, they go around literally engulfing or eating up the excess synapses, and this is the process we now know that complement directs. So why are these effects of complement on synaptic pruning important? We know that several psychiatric disorders are associated with changes in synapse number, and these may reflect either a loss of synapses and thus potentially excessive pruning, or perhaps an excess of synapses reflecting not enough pruning. So for example, in schizophrenia, where we know there are genetic factors predisposing to greater complement activation, preclinical evidence now suggests that greater synaptic pruning is occurring, at least in a dish. But this is consistent with evidence in the human brain showing a reduced number of synapses in schizophrenia. So importantly, there's been a lot of investigation of the complement pathways that drive synaptic pruning, but there's been little exploration beyond these pathways. And my research has recently shown that the C3 receptor, which we previously linked to anxiety, may be able to inhibit synaptic pruning. So in these mice where we've switched off the C3 receptor, we actually see a reduction in the number of synapses they have, suggesting that there may be runaway pruning occurring. So this is of course interesting in terms of its implications for a range of psychiatric disorders associated with synapse loss. So in terms of my future work, in my upcoming MRC project, I hope to test the prediction that the C3 receptor causes anxiety through abnormal synaptic pruning. However, generally very little is known about when and where pruning is occurring in the developing brain, and much of the preclinical literature has focused on the earlier waves of synaptic pruning occurring in infancy. But we know that the peak is indeed occurring in adolescence, and this time period is important due to its association with greater risk for developing mental health problems. So I want to look at the specific effects of manipulating the C3 receptor on pruning during adolescence and ask whether this excessive pruning leads to anxiety. If so, can we prevent that anxiety from occurring by using drugs that target the C3 receptor or microglia? And this is something I'm working on with the pharmaceutical company Takeda, who share a keen interest in the complement system as a therapeutic target for brain disorders. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleagues at Cardiff University and my funders, in particular the Hodge Foundation and the Waterloo Foundation. I'll take questions at the end, but now I'd like to hand over to my co-presenter, Neil.
Great, thank you very much, Laura. Just give me a second while I pull up these slides. Okay, well, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. So my name is Neil Harrison. I'm an academic psychiatrist, and I'm going to be talking over the next 10 minutes really about the more sort of clinically applied side of neuroimmunology, particularly with respect to psychiatry and mood disorders. Now, both Paul and Laura have already given you a fairly good sort of initial sort of overview of the innate immune system. And this is a system that has been very much implicated in psychiatric disorders. So in the periphery, the innate immune system is associated with lots of different cell types that respond to different types of infections. But within the brain, there's one key cell that's implicated, and that's this microglial cell that Laura has already spoken about. One thing I just wanted to highlight, and this will be a theme throughout the talk, is certainly when I was at medical school, we were taught that the brain and the body were completely separated by this blood-brain barrier, but it's now increasingly clear that this is far from a barrier and is in fact an interface, and the body and the brain communicate in multiple different routes, and including over the blood-brain barrier. Now, Laura's already given you quite a nice overview of the potential roles of microglia. So sort of about 15, 20 years ago, we largely thought they were involved in monitoring for disease and damage, but it's now increasingly clear, even within health, that they play really critical roles in brain development, learning and memory, and pruning connections. A couple of points I just wanted to highlight, though, is that they're also sensitive to stress, so psychological stress, and I'll show you some data on that and the implications of that. And also they're sensitive to inflammation in the body. So I'm going to show a little video just so you can get an idea of what these cells are like. This is a physiological microglial cell, and this is about 30 minutes in the life of a microglia. And you can see they're extremely dynamic cells. They're extending and contracting or retracting these processes as they sample around the brain. But these cells don't just exist in this type of shape or morphometry. They can also become activated. And so what I'm going to show in this video is just what happens to these microglia when you apply a non-infective sort of immune challenge actually within the brain. And you can see what happens is these cells, they start changing their shape, they start losing these processes, and they start moving. They start migrating towards the tip of the inflammation. And this is important because these cells in this activated state start releasing powerful toxins, and they're implicated in a wide range of different psychiatric and neurological disorders, as Paul and Laura have already said. So just stepping back for a second, I mean, how do we know that the brain is sensitive to inflammation in the body? Laura's already talked about these things called sickness behaviors. And as a psychiatrist, we've been particularly interested, myself and others working in this field, about how these sickness behaviors are induced. So what happens, how does the immune system communicate to the brain to induce these sickness behaviors that seem similar to depression? And the way that this has been done in sort of rodents, and it's also been done in humans. So this is some imaging work, some of the early imaging work that my group did. But essentially what it shows is there are multiple different parallel pathways through which the immune system can communicate to the brain. So one of them is via nerves, sensory nerves like the vagus, which is in fact a very, has a large number of sensory fibers within it. And our brains know very rapidly when we experience an infection. Within a couple of hours, you see these changes in brain activity. There's also these other routes whereby immune mediators, things like cytokines within the blood, can act more directly on the brain. And this is some PET data. Paul showed you some PET data earlier on, but this is in healthy individuals 3 to 4 hours after having an immune challenge, a non-infective immune challenge. And you can see a big uptick in the microglial activation following this. And in fact, this data has now become so sort of pronounced that there have been stories like this put forward. So this is the front cover of Scientific American from a couple of years ago, suggesting that in fact, maybe the immune system is our seventh sense. So it acts as a way of constantly monitoring the immune and infections within the body and communicating that directly to the brain. But of course, I'm a psychiatrist and working as a clinician, it's very interesting to know how the immune system acts on the brain. But more important, really, is what is its implication and how is it involved in mental health and mental illness. And there have been numerous studies now showing that if you chronically activate the immune system, chronically activate inflammation with drugs, for example, some patients are given pro inflammatory drugs to try and cure their underlying illness, for example, the treatment of hepatitis C, you can actually induce bona fide depressive episodes in previously healthy individuals. Now, we and other groups have looked using brain imaging to try and determine which regions of the brain are implicated and what the mechanisms are. I'm not going to show you individual studies, but I'm just going to show that essentially this field has come forward enormously over the last 10 to 15 years. And now there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of studies looking to see how the peripheral immune system acts on the brain to influence depression. And the take-home message here really is that those regions that we know are involved in idiopathic depression are also sensitive to inflammation. What about the opposite though? I mean, because again, we want to know about treating people with depression, and there've now been quite a number of studies. This was one that I was involved with through a large UK-wide, or in fact an international consortium, looking at what happens when you block inflammation. So these are just the names of different drugs or different cytokines that are targeted by drugs. And we have a lot of different drugs that can target and block inflammation. They weren't designed for depression. They were designed for treating things like rheumatoid arthritis or celiac disease or diseases of the body. But remarkably, they also show these antidepressant properties. So you can see everything to the right of this 0 line shows that they show antidepressant properties. And importantly, these effects were observed even if the person who was receiving this drug doesn't have an improvement in the disease that it's being used to treat. So even if their joints didn't get better, we still observe this improvement in depressive symptoms. As part of a large consortium that we at Cardiff are involved in, and which I actually lead the imaging components. Paul is also up here in the background, part of this consortium. We've also shown that people with depression who have raised levels of inflammation show a worse response to conventional antidepressants. So if you have depression and you have raised inflammatory markers, you're less likely to respond to conventional drugs. So this means there's an urgent need to try and develop drugs specifically for these groups of people. And this is one of the studies that we're currently undertaking. It's been paused because of COVID, but I'm really pleased to say it's now restarted, where again, working with the pharmaceutical industry, particularly with Janssen Pharmaceuticals, we're currently undertaking a clinical trial of a new, totally novel anti-inflammatory drug that acts on microglial cells, a bit like what Laura was mentioning before, to try and block the relationship between stress and inflammation. So let me just walk you through this. So essentially, in the context of stress, when we have a stressful stimulus, there's an increase in activity of these glutamatergic neurons, and they also release something called ATP. Interestingly, microglia have receptors on their surface for ATP, and when they experience ATP in the context of stress, they become activated, and this then is believed to trigger this neuroinflammatory response. So currently this trial is looking to see whether a drug that's been specifically designed to block this receptor can lead to an improvement in depressive symptoms. So I've just got one final slide, and before I wrap on that, I felt it would be important just to illustrate, given that we're doing this talk remotely, and the fact that the last year, fortunately not 3 years, we've been experiencing this COVID pandemic. I think we're all now very, very familiar about the effects that a virus in the body can have on the brain. And this is a large UK-wide consortium, again, that Cardiff is part of, involving all 4 nations, where we're seeking to understand what is happening either in the immune system or within the brain that relates to this, if you like, the psychiatric and the neurological complications of COVID. So I think we're all familiar with cases of stroke related to COVID, but there are also this long COVID syndrome where people have chronic long-term fatigue. So this large UK-wide study, we're seeking to try and understand in greater detail exactly how this is happening with a view to informing future treatment. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for your attention. And of course, thanks for the funders who've funded much of this work, including MRC, Wellcome, and some grant from the Hodge Foundation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Paul, Neil and Laura, for those great presentations. It's really exciting to see the work that's being done on this new emergent field, and particularly I think to see the potential to lead into kind of new therapeutic approaches for conditions where we really desperately need new treatments like Alzheimer's disease or severe depression. So I'm pleased to say that we've got some time for question and answers, and it's great that everyone's rejoined for that. Please do use the Q&A tab at the bottom if you'd like to submit a question. We've had one or two in this evening already, and as I say, one or two before. And we'll try and get through as many as we can. So here's one that was submitted before. By the way, the questions that have been submitted are absolutely great, so we've got plenty to discuss. So the first one is here. I think I'll address this one to Neil. So Neil, how widely recognized do you think the overlap between the immune system and kind of mental health conditions is by people like consultant rheumatologists or immunologists in the health service more generally?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Look, I think had you asked me this question 15 years ago, I think the answer would have been not very well understood. But over the last sort of 15 years, there's been a huge shift in people's understanding within rheumatology and other medical conditions, and now it's fully recognized. So those data that I showed you of some of these anti-inflammatory drugs, these were all done by industry. And at the time, they weren't particularly interested in the mental health outcomes, but they did record mental health data, and that's how that meta-analysis could be performed. What I'm pleased to say now is every single study using these sort of drugs now includes very good mental health outcomes. Yeah, so there's been a transformation over the last decade or so in understanding.
Brilliant. More questions coming in. I'll do one more that was submitted previously, and then we'll come to some of the ones that have been submitted just now. So one more submitted previously was, I think this might be for you, Laura, is what do we know about a kind of evolutionary perspective on this interaction between the immune system and the brain?
So I think it's a really interesting perspective. And one thing to consider is that, in particular with the complement system, it's an extremely ancient mechanism, probably our first means of immune defense. And it's likely or possible that complement may have evolved these actions in homeostatic control of cell proliferation, relevant to neurodevelopment at the same time or even before it evolved functions in immunity. It'd be interesting to know what Paul thinks of that, but that's one possible explanation. And also generally, nature likes complexity, but also it's we often see duplicity in the actions of these systems.
Brilliant, Laura. That's great. Okay, well, I'm going to turn to some of the questions submitted tonight. I hope we'll get through a few of them because they look great. So, Paul, one for you here, I think. This is a real area of interest, actually. Susan asks, do you think the immune system could also have a role to play in epilepsy?
Well, the short answer is probably. So, as you know, Jeremy, our neurosurgeon colleague, Liam Gray, is extremely interested in this. He works mainly in epilepsy and spends a lot of his time doing surgery to try and help people who have severe epilepsy. But what is clear from the animal models and from human studies is that there is certainly inflammation in those foci which are driving the storms in the brain which lead to the epileptic seizures. And I think whereas we don't yet know whether we can track and modulate the inflammation and therefore use that to dampen down epileptic attacks, it's certainly an area of interest and one where I think a lot more research is needed in order to ascertain whether that's a new approach to treating epilepsy, which might avoid Liam having to do surgery on quite so many people.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that Liam's also doing a trial to see how moderating immune responses to an epileptic focus can help improve, cognitive and mental well-being afterwards. So yeah.
Yes.
So great. There's another question which I think will be for Neil here from Hester. So this is really about the interaction between pre-existing inflammation and depression. So how do you know whether or not a depressive person also has an inflammatory response, which can be complicating perhaps the treatment of their depression and the like?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I did reply that one briefly, but essentially probably the best way of doing this currently is with a simple blood test called C-reactive protein. It probably costs about £1 to do this, or maybe even a little bit less. And we know in cardiology, for example, that levels of CRP relate to your risk of cardiovascular disease, whether you could have a heart attack. And it's increasingly becoming apparent that that they may play a similar role in depression. So that is probably at the moment the cheapest, easiest and quickest way of testing.
And as you've answered that one twice, I'll put on an extra one for you, Neil, which is Colin asks, what about anti-inflammatory nutrients like polyphenols? Could they help with depression?
Yeah, again, I mean, these are really interesting questions. I mean, there's less work. I guess this is a field that has expanded extremely rapidly over the last 10, 15 years. And there is less work sort of looking at these nutrient components in an experimental manner. But absolutely, I mean, the relationship between high-fat diet, for example, and inflammation is well known. So this is an area of burgeoning research interest.
Brilliant. And Heather asks, what about the link with type 2 diabetes? Is there a link between type 2 diabetes and neuroinflammation? And Paul is chewing my hand off to answer this question, so I shall let him answer it.
I think this really relates to what I said about body inflammation being a driver of brain disease. And certainly in dementia, we know this to be the case very clearly. And I'm sure Neil would also say it's the case in depression and so on. So what type 2 diabetes does, it itself is inflammatory, and also it's highly associated with obesity. And what we know about obesity, and particularly sort of central obesity which sticks adipose tissue around your gut, is a highly inflammatory focus. That fat tissue is actually driving inflammation in the body. So these markers that Neil talks about, they're higher in people who are obese, they're higher in people with type 2 diabetes. And that long-term, over many years, low-level inflammation is what links then to brain pathologies like Alzheimer's and probably like the neuropsychiatric disorders also.
Thanks, Paul. More great questions coming in, actually. So there's one here from Anna on, is there any research happening on the link with vaccinations and mood and mental health? And Neil and I have talked about this, and Paul actually. So it's like a massive natural experiment of what happens when you, well, induced experiment of what happens when you give people an acute inflammation. Neil has actually done work on exactly this kind of thing with other inflammatory challenges in the past. So Neil, maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for another nice question. I mean, we and various other groups have used vaccinations as an experimental way of inducing mild inflammation to try and work out what is happening within the brain. So we've tended to use typhoid vaccine, but other people have used flu vaccines and various other studies. Now, with regard to sort of the COVID vaccinations, I'm not currently aware of any work that is ongoing. I mean, certainly, as Jeremy says, this is something we have discussed, but currently I'm not aware of any work specifically looking at that.
Yeah, brilliant, Neil. That's great. So Carol asks a question which I think is close to all our hearts, and certainly one for Neil. Sorry, for Paul to answer at this stage, I think, which is, you know, how far away do you think we are, Paul, from inflammatory related treatments for Alzheimer's disease, which clearly we need?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So currently, the drugs that we have to use in Alzheimer's disease don't affect the actual course of the disease at all. They may have some impact on patient well-being for a period of time, but they're not going to stop the progression of the disease. And that's a completely crazy situation to be in with such a common, such a horrible disease. I think the discovery that inflammation was a ubiquitous component of this disease has led a lot of people to get very excited about using anti-inflammatory type approaches to treat dementia. And I think it'll come. It's not going to come in the next couple of years, but the amount of investment and the number of teams which are now working in this area suggest that we will find ways of treating dementia, or perhaps preventing dementia by giving the right sort of an anti-inflammatory at the right stage in the disease process in the right patients. So I think that kind of tailored approach, and with early treatment to prevent rather than to treat, is going to be the way that we will have an impact on dementias going forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. A question for you, Laura. This one's about early life and development. This is a pre-submitted question, and the immune function. Do things that happen to you in your childhood, like trauma or difficult events, can they have a sustained effect on the immune function in the brain?
So we know that early life stress can impact the way in which the stress response develops through later life, and we know that the stress response and the immune system are intricately linked. So yes, I think they are going to be related.
Yes, thank you. I agree, and I think there's one of our colleagues, Nicola Tusolman, has some evidence that might well be the case. So that's great. Question from Ellie here, which is, do we think that the association between inflammatory diseases and depression is bidirectional at all? So could it be that depression also increases the risk in the other way around? That's not something I've actually thought about previously myself. I don't know. Does anybody particularly want to answer that one?
It's an interesting question. It's really hard to dissect, though, isn't it? Because I think what's cause and what's association here. I think it would be really hard to pull that out. If you're depressed, and lots of people who are depressed have very poor lifestyle choices as a consequence, and those poor lifestyle choices might be in themselves pro-inflammatory, obesity, lack of exercise, etc., which may then lead to risk of dementia. But it's going to be really hard to say that the depression rather than the impact of the depression is what's driving that.
Can I just add that I believe there have been genetic studies looking at the risk genes identified in psychiatric disorder, and they have identified shared risk between psychiatric disorders and inflammatory disorders.
So I'm being sent signals to tell us that we need to wrap up soon, but I can't resist just a little bit more, because the questions that are coming in are really great, actually. So I'm going to go on just for a minute or two more, take a liberty. So David asks, what's the role of physical activity in boosting immune function and reducing inflammation? So I'm going to turn to Laura and then Neil to answer that, because it's a great question.
So I don't actually know much about physical activity and its relationship to immune function. I know that physical activity in general is very good for, so for example, exercise boosts a process called neurogenesis in the brain, whereby new cells are added, which play an important role in regulating mood and also learning and memory. And we know that the immune system plays a role in that as well. But yes, you better go to Neil for a more direct answer on that.
That was actually a very good answer already, Laura, but I'll hand over to Neil as well for the last word. And then I'm afraid to say we probably better wrap up, even though it's great having this discussion. So Neil, do
I'm not going to add very much. I thought Laura gave a very nice answer. I mean, inflammation, exercise is pro-inflammatory in the acute phase. So you get a big peak in inflammatory signals acutely, but there have been a lot of groups looking at this. I think there's a group in Bristol that's looking at the anti-inflammatory effects of exercise. It's also quite a potent antidepressant exercise. I mean, there's clear, good, solid evidence that it's antidepressant. As Laura says, neurogenesis, the hippocampal shrinkage is one of the more robust findings in depression. So whether that is driven through neurogenesis and those effects is yet to be fully determined, but that's likely to be a mechanism.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. Thank you for the great questions. We could have actually gone on, I feel, and I would like to reassure people who put a question in that we'll have a look at those and get an answer back to you as best we can. So yeah, thanks a lot for your enthusiasm. So really appreciate your attending, as I say, on a sunny evening. And we're very, proud, I think, of the work that's going on in Cardiff in this exciting new emerging field. And do feel free to get in touch if you'd like to know any more about this work or support it in any way. That's obviously wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. We'll get an email out to you shortly with a copy of the recording, and we hope to welcome you back to another event very soon. Diolch yn fawr. Thanks everybody.